believe that leadership isn't a position or a role, it's an action and a choice. I believe that leadership can be learned. I believe that great leaders emerge from adversity. I believe that Happy Valley is full of great leaders. These are their stories. Welcome to the Happy Valley Leaders Podcast. Today I have with me Ed Zuech. So Ed's the Director of IT in the College of Agricultural Sciences at Penn State. In addition, Ed is also the 193rd Special Operations Maintenance Group Superintendent. So he's a Chief Master Sergeant in the Air Force, in the Air National Guard. So Ed, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Dave. Thanks. First, I just say I'm humbled that you'd asked me to be part of this, and I'm grateful that you're going to give me an opportunity to be a guest host and interview you one of these days.
Well, we'll have to see about that one. That's one of the reasons I like being on this side is I get to ask all the questions. I don't have to answer them.
I hear you.
So Ed, tell me a little bit about the role that you have at Penn State and how you got to Penn State.
Absolutely, Dave. I've been at Penn State just starting my 14th year, and I'm the IT director for the College of Ag Sciences. But I was kind of a late bloomer. You know, I graduated high school in '86, graduated college in '96, and then spent some time overseas in Saudi Arabia doing some contractor work. And then that's really where my IT kind of background began. I spent time with Delta Health Systems in Altoona as a configuration manager. Then I moved to State College and worked for Secor, where they did broadband management and hardware type services for all broadband services, and spent about 8 years there, and then was laid off twice there, put myself out of a job. They were acquired by a company called Aris, and I was fortunate enough to connect with Neil Vines and the College of Ag Sciences. So here I am.
Okay, great. So Ed, as you think about your leadership development and looking back, is there any people or person that influenced you to become the leader that you are today?
Yeah, Dave, being in the Air Force for, almost 35 years now, I've had a lot of leaders, a lot of influence, right? Even the organization itself has influenced, I think who I am. They preach core values of integrity, service before self, and excellence in all we do. So I could probably go through a whole bunch of names, but it was weird. I was at my dad's 80th birthday party, and I was, kind of speaking to a crowd. And at that point, or preparing for that, I realized that, I lived those examples long before I was taught them in the Air Force. And I think the influence that I talk about is my parents, both my mom and my dad. My mom was a homemaker, but she helped kind of any way she possibly could to raise her kids and kind of give us the stuff we need. She cleaned churches, cleaned houses, and kind of all sorts of projects. My dad worked in a steel mill, for 40 years down at Bethlehem Steel. And, and I think about their commitment, their commitment to their family, the community, they're avid community members, for either the church block parties or the church itself, the Lions Club, the Knights of Columbus, all those kind of service organizations that they continue to, give, because the community was a greater cause than themselves. I think about, one specific instance where I think my dad had a lot of impact was, I was a junior, and my dad took me to the steel mill. And he was working night shift, and he took me in there, and it's dirty and filthy and hot. And he introduced me to all his friends, that worked the night shift. And he let me stay there the whole shift, and really as a junior, kind of having your eyes open to what real work is really kind of had an impact. But, when we were leaving that day, he's like, I want you to do better. You could do more, And he said, this was good for me. I raised my family and so forth, but, you have more to give and more to attain. And that's why I brought you here tonight. And that's really one of the reasons one of the main reasons I enlisted in the Air Force.
Wow. That's a great story. I love how your dad didn't want to just tell those words. right? He wanted you to experience it. What a great lesson for leaders. And we want to pass something on. It's one thing to tell people, it's another to show them and let them experience it. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and I was able to see that example all the time, right? And growing up in Mount Carmel, kind of a small coal region town, somebody needed to like put an addition on their house. Well, okay, let's get together and, do it, right? Let's get it done. And I remember guys coming to our house to help him build an addition onto our house. And, we had a small row house, so we're trying to extend it. But, somebody's dishwasher breaks down or their car breaks down, they're getting up all hours of the day, or I'm sorry, all hours of the night to go and give, right? And not that they had a lot to give, but whatever they had, they were willing to give. But that example, like to be part of the community, to be part of those organizations, give their time for a greater cause, certainly resonated. And like I said, I saw that example long before I really knew the words that the Air Force taught me. But yeah, it was impactful.
Yeah. I would say this is the 10th episode I've done of the podcast, and that's a theme that comes through of influencers, is the influence of parents, and not just what they said, it's the model that they said, right? It's like you said, it's what they do and what you saw them doing, and that model of service to their family and service to others that really drives leaders, because great leaders are the greatest leaders are all about serving others, right? So yeah, that's been a common theme. It's been neat to hear those stories.
Yeah, pretty fortunate, Dave.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ed, you spent a lot of time in the Air Force. How has the Air Force and people you've seen in the Air Force kind of influenced your leadership and your leadership style?
Yeah, I've had, I think like all of us, we learn from all those examples. Some of them are really good, and some of them are like really good not to do. And
Yes.
and I certainly have a handful of those, and I think one that really sticks out is one of my first commanders when I joined the 112th Air Control Squadron here in State College. We did all sorts of stuff, we were forward deployed, we were a unit where we would kind of pack up all the equipment and get it in 5 tons and 2.5 or deuces and halves and drive it someplace, set it up. We'd generate our own power. We would basically get a radar going, and then we would control an airspace. We would be battle managers in that area. And he hit a couple things that really stuck out to me, and one of them was like, you work hard and you play hard. And we're deployed for like 10 days, and showers are limited, and food is cold, and you're working 12-hour shifts. And then when you're not working your primary job, you're doing other duties like sitting in a foxhole or doing stuff like that. But when that exercise, when that deployment ended, it ended with like there was like case of beer, and there was some food, and there was some stuff that was like one of those things, just like thank you for everything you did, and kind of that appreciation for that work was very clear, right? You knew there were clear expectations on what needed to be accomplished, and then you knew at the end of it, you're gonna get the pat in the back because you did the work to get it done and accomplish the mission. Another key element I think that we still talk about today, and I think you and I've joked about it too, is like flexibility, right? Flexibility is the key to air power, and it's really the key to everything, right? And having that plan to move stuff ahead, and then knowing when things start to go south or sideways, how to quickly react, and that comes back to like how you're trained, and all the efforts. And I think, we revert to who we are at the core, in those times of crisis, right? And no matter how well you're trained, how well you think you're prepared, you only go back to that level of training that you really put in, right? And there's that level of preparation gets you to that center where when things go bad, when there's time of stress or conflict, that's where you kind of fall back to. And so we trained hard, and I think it really put us in a good position.
I like your point about flexibility, and I see this, I think you and I have a unique perspective from military background and in IT. Is sometimes I work with some IT people that get very frustrated as the requirements are changing. And and I understand that, you have done a lot of planning and work around a certain set of requirements, and now it feels like they're changing on them. And I have to remind people, like, that's good. They want you to do something different because we can. And let's be calm about this. Let's not get upset. I think as a leader, one of the things I try to do is like, this is okay. Right. To your point about flexibility. And I think as leaders, we can help our teams have that mindset of flexibility. So there's not this frustration that things are changing. Like, this is just part of what happens. So I've seen that. And I think, again, in IT, we tend to maybe some people will get a little frustrated about that. But to your point, we can use it as an asset and focus on flexibility.
Yeah, I agree with you completely, Dave. And you think about like what's really important. Like we, in our roles, we're service units, right? We serve the mission, right? So even though it's a little bit harder on us potentially to make those changes in the long run, if it has the impact towards, teaching, research, or service, or what the mission is, that's the kind of the connection that sometimes we lose, and sometimes helps when you make that connection to kind of be a little bit more flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've definitely had an opportunity during COVID to demonstrate that, right?
Yes, we have.
and we still are, as we were just talking about before we got on before we started the interview. We're doing at this time right now in September of 2021, we're still doing COVID testing a year later, maybe than we thought we would, longer than we thought we would. And we're adjusting to the changing conditions.
Absolutely.
So Ed, can you think back on a time of adversity in your life and how that influenced you to be the leader that you are today?
Yeah. I kind of look back, and there's probably like a million stories, right? There's like, I tried out for a high school football team, or, and went to, got on a plane for the first time in my life and went to Lackland Air Force Base in Texas to go to basic training, or even like, being deployed, right after, activated for a year after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. All those things I think have given those opportunities for, we're adverse, how to deal with some adversity. But I think the one I would probably talk a little bit about, maybe it's a little bit unique, and I feel like it's kind of really shaped who I am, is right after I graduated college in 1996, I had an opportunity to go and work for Raytheon. And I was sent over to Khamis Mushay, which is in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's down in the southwest quadrant of the country. And quite honestly, it's not like the desert that you think of when you think of the Middle East. This was like almost like Southern California, where you're on an escarpment about 7,000 feet, it was like 75, 80, all the time. And I could really hit a softball a mile. So it really was kind of a great experience. But what I think about going there is like, I went there, and not really knowing what to expect. It's before the internet, it's before all this information was available. And, I got there and I'm like, boy, I look different, right? I have a different religion than they believe. My culture is different. My values were completely different. Like, and it was like, it was the most diverse culture that I've ever lived in. And what I think I learned from that, is kind of, empathy and kind of humility. And the story I think that I kind of tell my friends are like, I'm driving to work one day, and, my car breaks down right in the middle of this intersection. And I'm like, what am I going to do? It's this big old Chevy Capri, I'm trying to push it, I'm in like dress shoes and, tied. This car is a big, heavy beast, and I'm like sweating, it's 80 degrees out. I'm trying to push this car, and there's like, it seemed like 1,000, but probably hundreds of cars all like pointing at me and honking, giving me these hand gestures, which I think I interpreted pretty well. They're honking and yelling, but the idea is there's like hundreds of people, and that might be an exaggeration, but that's a picture of mine, that we're just yelling and screaming, and they're like, get out of the way. And I'm doing my best to do that, and really, like, I am the outsider. Do I belong here or not? The whole bunch around that. And it seemed like hours, but it was probably about 3 or 4 minutes that I'm trying to get this car out of the intersection. And one of my students is in the back, and he kind of figures out what's going on, and he realizes it's me. And he gets out and he comes up to me and he's like, he starts yelling to all these people. And I don't know what he said, but I think it was along the line of like, hey, he's with me, let's help him. And before you know it, there are like 10, 12, 15 people like pushing my car. It's probably going 60 miles an hour at all the, with the people helping. But everybody, once they knew, like I was kind of like a trusted, partner with the Saudi Air Force, and somebody could like vouch for me. I was out of the intersection pretty quick, and there's people like going to get me water and like food and like trying to help me any way they can. They're looking under the hood, and it was just like that one person stood up and said, hey, he's with me, I know him, or whatever he said, changed that whole attitude towards me. I wasn't just this, this outsider blocking the intersection, trying to get them to go where they need to go, or limiting them from where they needed to go. Now they were all like, how can we help you? What can we do? And the value of, I think it's, the two values I go back to, like, our relationships, and they're all founded on trust. And he trusted me enough. I'd built enough of a relationship that he was willing to go out in front of this like angry mob, if you will. And, these people honking and yelling, and he turned to him like instantaneously, and got me off, got me some help, got me back to where I was living, and but that relationship that was so powerful, and in that situation, I'm like, what am I going to do? I can't move this car by myself, and really, really powerful, and I think as that relationship developed, he was really became a friend. Again, women have more restrictions in that country, and he brought my family, my wife, into his house, and they served us dinner, and in some traditional fashions. And then when I was leaving that job, they had like a traditional goat grab, and they made me the guest of honor, right? So it went from like, what are you doing here, and why are you here, to like, please don't leave, we need you, right? And that relationship was pretty powerful.
Wow. That is a great story about relationships. And I think, the other thing I talk about in the intro of the podcast is anyone can be a leader, right? So that person recognized the problem, stood up, was a leader. People listened to him. And because the relationship you had all of a sudden flipped the script in what was happening with his active leadership.
Yeah, I'll be honest, Dave, I almost felt like a rock star, like all these people are like, giving me food and water, and yeah.
It's also a cool, I think, story about community, right? The community you described in Mount Carmel, helping each other because the community had, and now here you are in Saudi Arabia, and you became a part of that community because of that trust relationship, and look at what they were did. So there's a humanness to community that goes across cultures. Yeah, very cool.
You took me way back on that one. I'm like, wow, I could see it like it happened yesterday.
Ed, talk a little bit about, living in the world of higher education and IT in higher education and in the military simultaneously. I mean, I've interviewed three retired military people who have lived in those worlds at different times, but you live them at the same time, because you go off and you'll do, a stint in the Guard and come back to your job. Talk about how
Dave, can you hear me? I lost audio.
So Ed, I've interviewed people who have both military experience and who work in higher ed, but all of those examples in the past were people who were in the military, retired, and then began to work in higher ed. You're the first person I've interviewed that has worked in both worlds basically at the same time, right? So you'll go off and you'll have a stint with the Guard for a certain period of time, come back into higher education. And I'm sure there's days where you do both in the same day if you're doing some work through email or remotely with your Guard unit. Can you talk about the similarities and differences in how you lead in those different environments?
Yeah, I love the contrast, right? Because it really is a big contrast, and I think having opportunity to do both at the same time has made me, I hope to be a better leader because of that. But as being in the military, and being in higher ed, certainly big differences, right? Like, higher ed, like 99 people say yes and one person says no, and the answer is no, right? So the way of influence is a lot different than in the military, where 99 people say no and one person says yes, and you do it anyway, right?
Depending on who that one person is.
Exactly. So it's certainly a challenge, and I'll be honest with you, the way kind of the military is evolving, and the way as the millennials have kind of introduced themselves into the military, and kind of helping us kind of take it to the next level. The skills that I hope to have acquired at Penn State and in higher ed, certainly align more to what that new kind of idea, that new type of leadership that the Air Force is looking for, right? And that the airmen, kind of like crave, that they, to be included and to be respected and have their voice heard, and I think, it's just a prime time, especially the leader, like the senior leaders, in the Air Force. We're being led by General Brown right now, and he has this idea of, accelerate change or lose. And the idea is, it's not like old goats like me, who are going to come up with that innovation, right? It really is our airmen who grew up on this technology, and to them it's second nature, and I think it's, trying to find ways to listen and kind of empower them differently, right? And trying to keep them within the area, but, leveraging that differently. So certainly different sets of skills, they're both influencing, some influencing before a decision and some influencing after the decision, I think is kind of a key way to look at that as well. But, I feel like it has made me a better overall, I hope to think, leader, because, both situations.
Yeah, I like that answer, and I absolutely think that's true. I think there's a misperception of the military, and I've talked to, a couple of the folks I've interviewed before, is that, you just give an order and then it's done. And there are certainly situations where that's the case, but anytime you can explain the why behind what you're doing and give people context, it just, as a human being, helps you, motivate you, and to understand the bigger picture, so that when you make these micro decisions that your boss is not always going to be there, you're understanding how that can influence the solving the problem, either in a good way or a bad way, right? So, and those are the things that I see, that I've learned in higher education about influence and change, and helping people with change, that I think I see now the good leaders that I worked with in the military did already.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have to, but they did. And those are the most effective ones that understood some of the things that maybe we think are new now. I don't think are always new. I mean, I remember that, the concept of commander's intent, the
Mm-hmm.
commander spending some time explaining, this is what I want us to do, and this is why, and here's the context, so that you can work kind of autonomously, with that direction.
Yeah, and I think that's key. And when you say like the best leaders, I think that, like, how do you tell that? It's, and like where the enlisted will follow, right? Where morale is high and people are resilient, and they're like committed or connected to that mission. It's easy to tell, right? Morale is high, esprit de corps is like off the charts, and it's all that stuff you talked about, giving the intent and then empowering them to get the job done, and it may not be exactly the way you have done it, but the same result, right? Put us in a good spot to accomplish the goal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love the concept. Jocko Willing talks about ownership, right? And giving people ownership, and when they have ownership, what they'll do on their own, without needing to feel like you need to manage what folks are doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, again, then you go back to like, motivation and then retention and, mission complete and successfulness, it's when people are connected, right? When their people are empowered, when they have the autonomy to, to do what they need to do, there's motivation is high, right? And then all good things come from that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important for people who don't have the military experience to hear that we're not a group of robots, we're a group of human beings. And
Yeah.
things like empowerment and autonomy are just as high motivators for military people as anyone else. And sometimes maybe even more, because so many in the military are they're hard chargers. They want to be trusted. They want to be aggressive. And if they feel like they're being micromanaged, they can't do that. And it's very frustrating.
Yeah. And, again, as I talked about, like General Brown's like vision for like, the future wars that we need to prepare for, the technology is no longer the difference, right? The number of weapons is no longer the difference. The difference will be our human capital, right? Will be us, right? Investing into people, kind of giving them the intent, empowering them and giving them the mastery to be excellent at what they do. And that's going to be the difference, right? It's everybody has the technology now.
Yeah. And isn't it interesting that message, while it's being framed in the idea of we're at higher technology levels, that taking care of your people, that's not new at all, right? I mean, you and I heard that from the very beginning of our training. You take care of your people, they'll take care of you. But now we frame it differently. But that's a truth that has, goes throughout the ages. And you and I both are firm believers in.
Absolutely. Yeah, we benefited from that and we still benefit from it today.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ed, I know, in the Air Force, you have certain professional military education you do. So you're regularly being exposed to not just leadership situations, but leadership development and training. Is there anything that you can share with the audience in ways that you have improved your leadership that is accessible to people who aren't in the kind of roles that you are, whether it's books or podcasts or authors, or what would you recommend to someone who wants to grow their leadership skills?
Yeah, I would probably the stuff I think that has helped define who I am, are probably not necessarily the military things, right? And I think the things that I'm talking about now are the things that the military is kind of adopting today, right? As in our professional military education, so, again, as we talk about like either my philosophy or what's important, people are important, right? That's what it boils down to. And I believe success, basically everything, success, relationship, mission accomplishment is all founded on trust, right? So I think, the things that I focus on that I think are important that I'm trying to instill into the senior leaders, at the maintenance support group are things like, I'm a big fan of the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. And if you look at the pillar that he talks about, it's built on trust, right? If there's trust, you'll have, if there's trust, you won't be afraid to like have disagreement, or what he calls conflict. If you're able to put your voice out there and have it heard, you're more likely to commit, right? And be part of that. And if you're able to commit, then you're going to hold yourself accountable and then the results will come, right? So I believe the 5 Dysfunctions of a team is kind of a pillar, right? I think the second part of that would be David Horsager does a lot of research on trust, and he's a book called The Trust Edge. And he basically talks about, how to build that trust. So to me, it's like all on that bottom layer of that pyramid that the team's, function or dysfunction is built upon. But it's, he has basically 8 pillars that he talks about that, that it's not this warm fuzzy, like let's hold hands and, sing around the campfire, or, fall backwards off a table and hope somebody catches you, right? It really is actionable behaviors that everything we do will either increase or decrease trust, right? We talk about those pillars, of clarity, compassion, competency, commitment, connection, contribution, and consistency. A lot of C's in there, right? But I think, which is in the book, and I think they're well tested, right? And I am a firm believer of trust, and being intentional, in those categories. And it is choices, it's behaviors. And then I think the last piece that kind of ties it all together in my mind is Simon Sinek, right? I'm a big Simon Sinek fan, like leaders eat last, the infinite game, start with the why, those kind of things, are so people focused, right? And I think, especially the infinite game, as you think about, how hard we push to get like certain accomplishments, and it's most games that we're in are not like games like, Penn State's going to play on Saturday, right? It's not a finite game. It really is an opportunity. It's like, how long do you stay in the game, like, and keeping your people resilient and empowered and moving towards the mission. And there's no end game in that, right? We want to keep doing this and keep evolving and being better. So like, they're the three like authors in books, I think, that like help me kind of keep grounded. And that's the kind of stuff I try to teach to the senior enlisted leaders, in the military that I'm around. And then the last one, I got to throw this in, and you probably laugh. Most people probably will laugh, but I think Rocky is the best movie ever made. And I think it is like, a lesson in leadership and just how to be resilient, right? And there's humility in there, and really like in very simplistic approach, he's like, he says what he's going to do and he does it, right? And no matter what the consequences, no matter what the odds, and most of us aren't getting our face beat in every day, and I know it's a movie, but kind of give you a little latitude with that it would have been easy to like, okay, I got beat up enough, I quit, right? Well, and he said, all I want to do is go to distance, right? And under all circumstances, even the corner, everyone in his corner, 14th round, everyone's like, stay down, right before the infamous, gut me mix scene. He's basically saying, he gets up, against his managers, direction, Apollo can't believe it. But, I just think about like, what would it be like to be that passionate about something, right? That committed to something that no matter what odds and no matter what circumstances, you're going to like honor your word and you're never going to give up. And anyway, I think there's like, again, humility in there. I think there's, hunger in there, tenacity to keep doing stuff, and believe it or not, this is probably, I know this will probably be a longer debate, but, I believe there's some emotional intelligence in there too, which I think are kind of three traits of, great teammates, right? And I think, again, great leadership as well.
That's great. Definitely. So the first three definitely were ones that resonated. I had heard other guests on the podcast talk about Patrick Lencioni. I think I had multiple guests talk about the 5 dysfunctions of a team. I'm a big Simon Sinek fan. We'll put links to all these in the show notes. Definitely the Rocky one's unique, but I like it. Grew up in the Philadelphia area, so definitely a Rocky fan. And it's interesting, just to take some of that seriously, though, this idea of perseverance as a leader. Where have you seen that play out? Where someone's a leader's personal willingness to persevere in difficult circumstances and how that influences a team. Can you think of any examples from your life where you've seen that?
I'm trying to think of it as like a specific example, but in more generalistic terms is like, sometimes we're just asked to do stuff that don't make sense, right? And in our job in the military is like, really to do, right? That's what we're told what to do. There are some leaders that I've seen just kind of stand up and kind of question in a very respectful way that, makes us think, is this something we should do or shouldn't do, right? And I think that, the leaders that I've seen do that, I think my current commander and my most recent commander and some other commanders I know, I think I really respect that the way that, yes, we got to do this, but asking, standing up and asking those questions in a respectful way, that maybe the directive doesn't change, but maybe how the directive might change, right? or maybe the timeline of the directive, or maybe some more clarification, and and when you get to be at level, and when you start questioning up, it certainly puts your career in a crosshairs, right? Because we've seen where people's careers have been halted because they didn't just show up in color, right? And I think I've seen enough of that, probably smaller scenarios, maybe not as big. And I think probably if I go back to maybe one example, Dave, that specific just kind of came to me when my last deployment in 2014, I was over in Qatar, and we were part of the kill chain. Every bomb that was dropped, there was a process, right? And we took it very seriously to evaluate collateral damage, right? We knew what the type of munition, we knew the effects of that. We had to make sure that we had the double checks. We had to make sure that the partner countries agreed. It was a long process, but to do the right things, that was necessary. And I do remember one time working with the battle cab commander, where one piece of that information we didn't have. We didn't have the accurate collateral damage estimate, and it held up, kind of a strike, and and it held it up long enough that the strike was called off. Planes had to go back to where they were because we're fueling and weather and stuff like that. So we missed an opportunity, but he stood up and he did, because we have this defined process to do the right thing, and he followed it. And in that aspect, he was commended for what he did, and I and watching that and appreciating that. And that was he worked directly for a 3-star general, the Combined Forces Air Force commander. And, he could have easily, probably been sent home or done whatever, but, it was the right call, and he was appreciated for the right call.
It's a great story. I think that says a lot about a really healthy culture, that in that situation where you give up an opportunity to do something you really want to do, you've trying to get a bad guy, an enemy. But to your point, we're not going to cut corners because of how serious this is, and that the culture would reward that and not denigrate that because you didn't accomplish the mission. And it's back to the infinite game, right? Could have won that game of taking out that whatever that target was, but in the infinite game, doing it right was more important. Yeah. The other thing that comes to mind, Ed, when I think about kind of riffing off your idea of Rocky, but this idea of perseverance as a leader, I think my experience, one of the hardest things to do as a leader is to take an order that maybe you have pushed back against it and it hasn't changed. And now you have to turn around to your team an order that you don't really support and ask your team to do it, and do it in a way that's respectful, and assuming that a lot of times they're thinking the same things that you are about the mission. Maybe you even got some of your pushback from them because they pushed back on you. But you still have to accomplish the mission with all the concerns and doubts that you and maybe your team has. And you've got to lead and motivate. I think that's the hardest thing to do as a leader, to be respectful enough of the people you're leading to be honest with them that this is not necessarily how we would choose to do it, but we also work in an organization where we're going to do it, and darn it, we're going to do it the best we can. I find that to be some of the hardest situations. I'm curious if you've experienced some of that in your career.
Yeah, almost all the time, right? I mean, being in this role, and I think I go back to like the 5 dysfunctions of a team too, because there's this element of trust that everything is built upon, right? Both with the team that you lead and the team you're part of, right? And I think the book kind of helps identify like what team you're part of. You're part of the highest team that you're. I'm not saying that very well, but I think of it in my aspect, right? I have a leadership team in the College of Ag Sciences in our IT department, right? And each one of those members on the leadership team represent a team. One represents support, one represents consulting, and one represents our systems and infrastructure, right? And they manage people beneath them, right? So when I talk about the commitment to the highest level team that you're a part of, I'm asking them for their commitment to our leadership team, right? And yes, I want them to represent the voices and the ideas of their team. And again, that goes back to being able to have some conflict and disagree. So at our leadership table, we should have that conversation where there's disagreement and passion and conflict, right? But the idea is, if you get all that stuff on the table and then you agree to the decision, yes, taking it back to your team in a unified fashion is really important, right? Now, when we look at like how that like stacks up, my commitment is to the college leadership team, which I'm a part of, right? So my piece continues to support the bigger piece, right? So that's where my commitment comes from. And then my team has to be committed to our team and manage the team below them. So if you see that graphic in your mind, it makes a little bit of sense that, each leader is part of several teams. It's just like the highest commitment has to be to the highest level team you're part of. And again, as you look at the widest spread of impact and influence, it has to be that way.
Yeah. So Ed, this has been a great conversation. Appreciate your time. If someone wanted to get to know Ed Zuech a little more, do you have any social media presence that if someone wanted to learn more other than just listening to this podcast?
Yeah, that's probably an Achilles tendon. I'm sorry, Achilles heel for me. I'm not very active on social media. I do have a Facebook account, but I don't look at Facebook often. My daughter's trying to get me on Instagram, and I will probably get on there someday. I know there's tremendous value with that. There's also tremendous toxicity with that too, right? Because it's just not real, right? I would say if you want to get a hold of me, I'm in the Agriculture Administration building, the 4th floor, 401. I love face-to-face stuff, even in these times, we can do it safely. I'm Zoom and stuff. Any types of contact, phone calls. Yeah, I love this part of this. I love the conversations that we're having, Dave, and I love to, serve in a way that helps other people grow and develop. And if I could do that for, you or anybody, no matter how you get a hold of me, I would certainly be willing to kind of help anyone who might need it.
That's great, Ed. And I think that's a testament to the person that I know that you are and your willingness to help anyone. And back to what you learned from as a kid in Mount Carmel from your parents. And that's one of the things I see in your leadership and why I wanted you on this podcast, whether you thought you were worthy, whatever that means, of being on this podcast. This has been a great conversation. And I think it's been cool to see some of the exact same lessons and ideas that I've seen in other podcasts you have, but then each one's a little bit different. So Ed, thank you for your service to our country. And thank you for your leadership and service at Penn State.
Thanks, Dave. Appreciate the time. Really do. Appreciate you as well.
Thank you for listening to the Happy Valley Leaders Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. Give us a review and share us with others. You can follow us on Twitter at HV Leader Podcast and on YouTube at Happy Valley Leaders Podcast. Remember, leadership is an action and a choice, so go be a leader.